The TV flickered, a dying pulse of static in the quiet suburban night. And I stood in Mr. Callahan's living room, screwdriver in hand, wondering how I'd ended up here. 28. I was no handyman. But when your neighbor of 10 years knocks on your door at dusk, his eyes pleading like a lost dog's, you don't say no. Especially not when it's Jim Callahan, the man who'd always been a steady fixture in our cul-de-sac. Like the oak tree in his front yard, solid, unyielding, but hiding something in its shadows. I'd known Jim and his wife, Margaret, since I was a kid, back when I'd mow their lawn for $20 and a lemonade. They were the perfect couple, or so it seemed, high school sweethearts, married for 30 years, with a daughter off at college. But tonight, with Margaret away visiting her sister in Chicago, Jim's house felt different, too quiet, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. He called me over to fix his ancient TV, a bulky relic from the 90s that refused to show anything but snow. You're good with tech, Ethan, he'd said, his voice rough but warm. Can you take a look? I knelt by the TV, its dusty plastic casing a stark contrast to the sleek flat screens everyone else had. Jim hovered nearby, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms tanned from years of yard work. He was 55, but time had been kind to him. His broad shoulders and steady hands spoke of a life spent building things, fixing things, holding things together. Yet tonight, his hands trembled slightly as he passed me a pair of pliers. You sure you don't want to just get a new one? I asked, half joking, glancing up at him. His hazel eyes caught mine, and for a moment, something flickered there, something raw, unguarded, like a secret clawing its way out. Some things are worth fixing, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite place. Even if they're old, even if they're complicated. I nodded, unsure how to respond, and turned back to the TV, my heart picking up a beat it shouldn't have. As I unscrewed the back panel, Jim sat on the couch, his knees bouncing nervously. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books, with shelves lining the walls, stuffed with novels and photo albums. A picture of him and Margaret at their wedding sat on the mantel, her smile bright, his a little forced. I wondered if I was imagining the tension in the air, the way his gaze lingered on me as I worked. You ever think about what you'd do differently, Ethan? He asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the TV static. I paused, the screwdriver hovering. What do you mean? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. If you could go back, live your life over, be who you really are. His words hung there, heavy as the August heat outside. I come out as gay at 19. A decision that had cost me friends and strained things with my parents for a while. But Jim, he was a married man, a churchgoer, the guy who coached Little League. What was he getting at? I don't know, I said carefully, my throat dry. I guess I'd try to be braver sooner. Tell people who I am without worrying what they'd think. I glanced at him, expecting a nod or a quick change of subject. Instead, his eyes softened, and he looked at me like I just handed him something precious. You're brave, Ethan, he said, almost a whisper, braver than most. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I fumbled with a wire, my hands suddenly clumsy. It's just a TV. Jim, I said, trying to lighten the mood. Not exactly saving the world. He chuckled. But it was hollow. It's not about the TV. I froze, the screwdriver slipping from my fingers. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and jarring. Our eyes met again, and this time, there was no mistaking it longing in his gaze. The kind that had been buried for years, maybe decades. My stomach twisted, not with fear, but with something else. Something dangerous and warm. Jim, I started, my voice barely above a breath. What are you saying? He stood, crossing the room in 2 strides, and for a moment, I thought he might touch me. Instead, he stopped short, his hands flexing at his sides. I've been lying to myself for a long time, he said, his voice cracking. And I'm tired. Ethan. I'm so damn tired. The TV buzzed behind me. Forgotten. I stood, my heart hammering, and faced him. He was close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, could see the lines etched deep around his eyes. This wasn't just about fixing a TV. This was about something bigger, something that could unravel everything. Jim, I said again, softer this time. Talk to me. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until he finally spoke. I've never told anyone this, he said, his voice raw. Not Margaret, not my daughter, but I've always known I wasn't who I pretended to be. My breath caught. I'd suspected, maybe, in the way he'd always been kind to me, even after I came out, when others in the neighborhood whispered. But hearing it, seeing the truth in his eyes, it hit like a freight train. You're saying, I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I'm saying I'm like you, he whispered, the words trembling. I'm gay, Ethan, and I've been hiding it my whole life. The confession landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the quiet room. I didn't know what to say, what to do. Part of me wanted to reach out, to tell him he wasn't alone. Another part screamed to run, to leave before this moment changed everything. But I stayed, rooted to the spot, because Jim Callahan wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was a man on the edge, and I was the only one there to catch him. The living room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with the weight of Jim's words. I stood there, staring at him, my mind racing to process what he'd just confessed. Jim Callahan, the man who'd grilled burgers at block parties and waved to me every morning, was gay, and he'd been carrying that secret for decades, locked away behind a life that looked perfect from the outside. Ethan, he said, his voice barely steady. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No. I cut him off, sharper than I meant to. Don't apologize. Not for this. My heart was pounding, a mix of shock and something else, empathy. Maybe. Or the strange pull of knowing someone's truth before they've even fully grasped it themselves. I took a step closer, careful, like approaching a deer in the woods. How long have you known? He sank back onto the couch, his hands running through his graying hair. Always, he said, staring at the floor. Since I was a kid. But back then, in the 80s, in a small town like this, you didn't say it out loud. You didn't even think it too loud. He let out a bitter laugh. I thought if I just married Margaret, had a kid, did all the things I was supposed to do, it'd go away. Like I could outrun it. I sat on the arm of the couch, keeping some distance but close enough to let him know I wasn't going anywhere. It doesn't work like that, I said softly. I tried denying who I was, too. Back in high school, when I dated girls and pretended to fit in. It was like trying to hold water in your hands, it always slipped through. I know that now, Jim said, his eyes meeting mine again. There was a desperation there, a hunger for understanding that made my chest ache. But I didn't then. And by the time I realized, I was in too deep. Margaret, Emily, this house, this life, it's all built on a lie. The TV hissed in the background, a faint reminder of why I was here. I glanced at it, then back at him. Why tell me now? I asked, my voice gentle but firm. Why tonight? He hesitated, his fingers twisting together. Because you're out. You're living it. I see you walking down the street, head high, not hiding. And his voice broke, and he swallowed hard. It makes me wish I'd been that brave. And tonight, with Margaret gone, it just came out. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hug him, to tell him it was okay, that he could still find a way to live his truth. But another part of me saw the danger in this moment, the way his eyes lingered on me, the way my own pulse quickened when he spoke. This wasn't just a confession. There was something else here, something unspoken but electric. And it scared me as much as it drew me in. Jim, I started, choosing my words carefully. You don't have to keep hiding. But this is a lot. For you, for Margaret, for everyone. He nodded, his jaw tight. I know. I don't expect anything from you, Ethan. I needed to say it. To someone. The honesty in his voice disarmed me. I'd spent years navigating my own identity, facing rejection and judgment. But I'd never had to carry it the way Jim had, decades of silence. A life built on a foundation that wasn't his. You're not alone, I said finally. You've got me. We'll figure this out. His eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. Instead, he stood and crossed to a small cabinet by the bookshelf. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. You want a drink? He asked, his voice steadier now, like he was grasping for normalcy. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. He poured us each a glass, and we sat in silence for a moment, the whiskey burning a path down my throat. The TV was still a mess of wires and static. But it didn't matter anymore. This wasn't about fixing a screen. It was about fixing something much deeper. Something broken long before I walked through his door. As the night wore on, Jim started to really talk. He told me about his childhood. About the boy he'd loved in secret at 16. About the shame that had kept him quiet. He told me about Margaret. How he'd loved her in his own way. But never fully. Never the way she deserved. And he told me about the fear that had kept him locked in this life, even as the world changed around him. I listened, my heart breaking for him, but also stirring with something else, admiration. Maybe, for the courage it took to say all this now. But as the whiskey dwindled and the clock ticked past midnight, I couldn't ignore the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me the bottle. or the way his eyes held mine a little too long. "Ethan," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't go back to pretending." I set my glass down, my mind a tangle of emotions. "You don't have to," I said. "But you need to figure out what you want. Not just for you, but for everyone this touches." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't just thinking about Margaret or his daughter. He was thinking about me. And as I stood to leave, promising to come back tomorrow to finish the TV, I felt the weight of that look follow me out the door. The next morning, I woke with Jim's words echoing in my head, each one heavy as a stone. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying the way his voice cracked when he said he was tired, the way his eyes searched mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. By the time I stepped onto his porch again, toolbox in hand, my stomach was a knot of nerves and curiosity. Jim opened the door before I could knock, his face a mix of relief and apprehension. "You came back," he said, like he'd half expected me to vanish. "Told you I would," I replied, forcing a smile. "That TV's not gonna fix itself." He let me in, and the living room looked the same cozy, cluttered, frozen in time. But the air felt different, charged with the weight of last night's confession. I knelt by the TV again, focusing on the tangle of wires to keep my hands steady. Jim sat nearby, pretending to read a newspaper, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You sleep okay?" he asked after a while, his voice casual but strained. "Not really," I admitted, glancing up. "You?" He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Kept thinking about what I said, wondering if I scared you off." "You didn't," I said, though part of me wasn't sure. I'd spent years building a life where I could be myself. But this Jim's truth, his vulnerability, it was pulling me into something I hadn't signed up for. "I'm glad you told me." He set the newspaper down, his hands restless. "I've been thinking about what you said, about figuring out what I want. Problem is, I don't know if I'm allowed to want anything." I paused, a wire pinched between my fingers. "You're allowed, Jim. Everyone is." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Even if it hurts people. Margaret, Emily, they don't deserve this." I didn't have an answer for that. I'd never been married, never had to weigh my truth against someone else's heart. But I knew what it was like to feel trapped, to feel like your own skin didn't fit. "You can't live for them forever," I said carefully. "You deserve to be happy, too." His eyes held mine, and there it was again, that spark, that dangerous pull. "You make it sound simple," he said, almost accusing. "It's not," I admitted, "but it's worth it." The rest of the morning passed in a strange rhythm. I worked on the TV, finally getting a faint picture to flicker through the static, while Jim hovered, offering coffee, tools, and stories that felt like pieces of himself he'd never shared before. He talked about his daughter, Emily, how proud he was of her, but how he feared she'd hate him if she knew. He talked about Margaret, how she'd been his best friend, but how he'd always held a part of himself back. By noon, the TV was working barely, but enough to call it a win. I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, and Jim handed me a cold soda. Our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, a mix of fear and something I didn't want to name. "You're good at this," Jim said, gesturing to the TV. "Fixing things." I shrugged, trying to ignore the warmth in my chest. "Just takes patience." He stepped closer, his voice low. "I wish I could fix myself that easy." "You're not broken," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "You're just figuring it out." He looked at me, his eyes searching, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more, something that would cross a line we hadn't yet touched. Instead, he nodded and stepped back, breaking the moment. "You want to stay for lunch?" he asked, his tone lighter but still heavy with meaning. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay, to keep talking, to keep unraveling the man in front of me. But another part screamed caution, reminding me that Jim was married, that his life was a house of cards waiting to fall. "I should get back," I said finally, "but I'll check in tomorrow." "Okay." He nodded, disappointment flickering across his face. As I left, I felt his gaze on my back, heavy and warm, like a hand I couldn't shake off. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way his voice softened when he talked about his fears, about the way his hand had brushed mine. I spent years dating, hooking up, living my truth without apology. But this was different. Jim wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a man on the brink of something huge, and I was caught in the gravity of it, whether I wanted to be or not. The next few days blurred into a strange routine. I'd go to Jim's under the pretense of checking the TV. But we both knew it was more than that. We'd talk about his past, my present, the world we lived in now versus the one he'd grown up in. Each conversation peeled back another layer of him, revealing a man who'd spent decades hiding, not just from others, but from himself. One afternoon, as we sat on his porch with iced tea, he told me about a moment in college, a fleeting connection with a guy in his dorm. Late-night talks that felt like more but never went anywhere. "I told myself it was nothing," he said, staring at the horizon. "But it was everything." I listened, my heart aching for the 20-year-old Jim who'd buried that moment, who'd chosen safety over truth. "You can't change the past," I said, "but you can change what comes next." He looked at me, his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name. "What if what comes next is you?" The words hit like a punch. I froze, the glass of tea sweating in my hand. "Jim," I said, my voice low, "you don't mean that. You're just processing." "Am I?" he challenged, leaning closer. "I've spent my whole life ignoring what I feel. I'm not doing that anymore." My pulse raced. This was dangerous territory, a line we couldn't uncross. "You're married," I said, the words heavy. "And I'm not sure I'm what you need right now." He flinched, but didn't back down. "I know what I feel, Ethan. For the first time in years. I know." The air between us crackled, and I stood, needing distance. "I need to think," I said, my voice shaky. "This is a lot." He nodded, his expression a mix of hope and fear. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said. "I just want you to see me." I left his porch that day with my head spinning. Jim wasn't just a neighbor anymore. wasn't just a man in crisis. He was someone I could care about, someone I was starting to care about, and that scared me more than anything. That night, I called my best friend, Alex, and spilled everything. "He's married, Ethan," Alex said, his voice sharp. "You don't want to be the guy who breaks up a family." "I'm not trying to," I snapped, pacing my apartment. "But he's in pain, Alex. He's been hiding his whole life. What am I supposed to do? Ignore that?" Alex sighed. "Just be careful. You're not responsible for his choices." But I felt responsible. Not for Jim's marriage, but for the way he looked at me. Like I was the only one who could help him find his way out. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to be that person. The next day, I went back to Jim's, determined to set boundaries. But when he opened the door, his eyes red from lack of sleep, all my resolve crumbled. "I told Margaret," he said before I could speak. "Not everything, but I told her I'm struggling, that I need to figure myself out." My heart stopped. "What did she say?" "She cried," he said, his voice breaking. "Said she's known something was off for years. She wants to fix it. But I don't know if we can." I stepped inside, the weight of his words settling over me. "What do you want, Jim?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes raw. "I want to be free. And I want you." The confession hung between us, undeniable now. I wanted to tell him to slow down, to think about Margaret, about his daughter. But the truth was, I felt it too, that pull, that connection. And as we stood there, inches apart, I knew we were on the edge of something that could change everything. The days that followed were a tightrope walk. Jim and I didn't talk about that moment on his porch, but it lingered in every glance, every accidental brush of hands. Margaret was due back in a week, and the clock was ticking, a silent pressure building between us. I kept going to his house, telling myself it was to help him through this. But deep down, I knew I was drawn to him, to the man he was becoming as he shed the weight of his secrets. One evening, as we sat in his backyard, the fireflies blinking in the dusk, he handed me a photo album. "This is who I was," he said, his voice soft. The pages were filled with pictures of a younger Jim grinning at a fishing trip, dancing with Margaret at their prom, holding baby Emily in a hospital room. But there was a shadow in his eyes. Even then, a hint of the man who'd been hiding. "You look happy," I said, tracing a finger over a photo of him laughing with friends. "I was," he said, "in moments. But it was never complete." He closed the album, his hand lingering on the cover. "You make me feel like I could be." My breath caught. "Jim, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "I know it's complicated, but I can't stop feeling this. Not now that I've let it out." I wanted to argue, to tell him we were playing with fire. But the truth was, I felt it too, the warmth of his presence. The way his honesty made me want to be braver. Too. "What happens when Margaret comes back?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't know. But I can't keep lying to her. Or to myself." That night, we stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, music we loved, places we wanted to see, the lives we might have lived if things had been different. It was easy, too easy, to forget the world outside his backyard. But as I left, his hand caught mine, just for a moment, and the warmth of his touch stayed with me all the way home. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. Jim's handwriting. Steady but hurried. Meet me at the lake tonight. 8 p.m. I need to tell you something. My heart raced as I read it. The lake was a quiet spot at the edge of town, where kids fished and couples walked at sunset. It was private, intimate, and the thought of meeting him there felt like stepping over a line I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I went. He was waiting by the water, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. I'm going to tell her everything, he said as I approached, his voice resolute. When she gets back. I can't live like this anymore. I stood beside him, the lake lapping at the shore. Are you sure? I asked. This will change everything. I know, he said, turning to me. But I'm sure about this, too. He reached for my hand, and this time, I didn't pull away. His fingers were warm, calloused, and the simple act of holding his hand felt like a promise, one I wasn't sure either of us could keep. As we stood there, the world quiet except for the water and our breathing, I felt the weight of what we were doing. This wasn't just about Jim coming out. It was about us, about the connection growing between us, fragile and dangerous and undeniable. The lake became our refuge, a place where Jim could be himself without the weight of his old life pressing down. We met there every evening, talking until the stars came out, our conversations weaving between hope and fear. He told me about his plans to talk to Margaret, to find a therapist, to start unraveling the life he'd built on lies. And I told him about my own struggles coming out. Losing friends, finding my place in a world that didn't always make it easy. One night, as we sat on a bench by the water, he turned to me, his eyes bright in the moonlight. I've never felt this alive, he said, his voice trembling with wonder. Not in 30 years. I smiled, my heart swelling. You're finding yourself, I said. That's what it feels like. He shook his head. It's not just that. It's you, Ethan. You make me want to be better, braver. The words hit hard, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was brief, soft, but it carried everything we hadn't said, the fear, the longing, the hope. When we pulled apart, his eyes were wide, his breath uneven. I'm sorry, I said quickly, panic rising. I shouldn't have. Don't, he said, grabbing my hand. Don't apologize. I wanted that. I've wanted that for days. We sat there, hands clasped, the world falling away. But even in that moment, I knew it couldn't last. Margaret was coming home tomorrow, and with her return, everything would change. The next morning, I woke to a text from Jim. She's back early. Can you come over? My stomach dropped. I went to his house, bracing myself for whatever came next. Margaret was in the kitchen, her eyes red but her smile polite as she offered me coffee. Jim looked like he hadn't slept, his hands restless as he sat at the table. I told her, he said when Margaret stepped out to take a call. Everything. My heart stopped. Everything. He nodded, his voice low. I told her I'm gay. I told her about you. The room spun. Jim. Why would you? Because it's the truth, he said, his eyes fierce. I'm done hiding. And I'm done pretending I don't feel what I feel. Before I could respond, Margaret came back, her expression unreadable. Ethan, she said, her voice steady but strained. Can we talk? All three of us. I nodded, my throat tight. We sat in the living room, the same room where this had all started. And Margaret spoke first. I don't know what to do with this, she said, her hands clasped tightly. But I know I love Jim. And I know he's hurting. So I want to understand. Her words were a lifeline, but they also broke my heart. She was fighting for him, for their life, even as he was letting it go. Jim reached for her hand, but his eyes flickered to me, and I saw the truth there. He was already halfway gone. The conversation with Margaret was raw, painful, and strangely honest. She asked questions when Jim had known, why he hadn't told her, what he wanted now. He answered as best he could, his voice steady but heavy with guilt. I sat there, feeling like an intruder. But Margaret insisted I stay. You're part of this now, she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. By the end, she was crying. And Jim was too. I don't want to lose you, she told him, her voice breaking. But I can't make you be someone you're not. I'm so sorry, Jim said, his hands shaking as he held hers. I never wanted to hurt you. I left them to talk alone, my heart a mess of emotions. I cared about Jim, more than I'd admitted to myself. But I didn't want to be the reason his marriage ended. Yet I couldn't deny the pull between us. The way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Over the next few days, Jim and Margaret tried to navigate their new reality. She moved to the guest room, and he started seeing a therapist, working through decades of shame and fear. I kept my distance, giving them space. But Jim texted me every night. Small messages that felt like lifelines. I'm okay. Thinking of you. One evening, he showed up at my apartment, his eyes bright with determination. I'm leaving, he said. Not just Margaret, but this town. I need to start over. Ethan. Somewhere I can be me. My heart leaped and sank at the same time. Where will you go? Seattle. Maybe, he said. Somewhere I can breathe. He paused, his eyes searching mine. Come with me. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Jim, I can't just. I know, he said quickly. It's crazy. But I've spent my whole life doing what I'm supposed to. I want to do what I want for once. And I want you there. I wanted to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and follow him. But I also knew he was still raw, still figuring out who he was. You need to do this for you, I said finally. Not for me. He nodded, disappointment flickering across his face. But he didn't argue. Instead, he kissed me, slow and deliberate, and I let myself feel with hope, the fear, the possibility of something real. Months passed, and Jim moved to Seattle. He and Margaret separated, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that their paths had diverged. She stayed in the house, and he sent her letters, apologizing, thanking her, promising to be there for Emily. I visited him once, flying out to see the life he was building, a small apartment, a job at a community center, a group of friends who knew him as Jim, the man who was finally free. We didn't end up together, not the way he'd hoped. I loved him, in a way, but I knew he needed to find himself before he could be with anyone. Instead, we became friends, real friends, the kind who could talk about anything, who carried each other's truths without judgment. One day, he called me, his voice bright. "I went to my first Pride parade," he said, laughing. "I felt like a kid again." I smiled, my heart full. "You're free, Jim. You did it." "No," he said softly. "You helped me do it." Looking back, I realized that fixing his TV had been the smallest part of what we'd done. We'd fixed something bigger: his heart, his truth, his chance at a life that was his own. And in the process, I'd found something, a reminder that love, in all its forms, is about helping someone become who they're meant to be, even if it means letting them go.